יש לנו הרגשה שכולם מדברים איתנו כשהם מחוץ לתפקיד, שמגיעים לתפקיד, נופל עליהם איזה כתר כזה שממסמר אותם לאיזו התנהגות שונה.
The tragic history of Palestine and Israel did not start on October 7th, 2023. As outsiders living within the imperial core, we can only glimpse through a narrow keyhole into this vast and tangled reality of broken promises and stolen dreams. From the origins of the Sunni and Shi'a division to the People's Crusade, from the Balfour Declaration to the creation of the State of Israel, from the Sèvres Protocol to the roots of Zionism, from the rise of Benjamin Netanyahu to the aftermath of October 7th. This is a story of blood and faith. This is a story of a world that produces radicals. Muhammad ibn Abdullah was born around the year 570 in the city of Mecca. Orphaned at an early age, he grew up among traders and shepherds, learning both the harsh rhythms of desert life and the delicate web of tribal alliances that held it all together. For most of his life, he lived as an ordinary man, working as a caravan merchant of renowned integrity. He later married his employer, Khadija, a wealthy widow who would become his closest confidant. Around the age of 40, Muhammad began retreating to a cave on the mountain of Hira, just outside Mecca. There, during one of his vigils, he experienced a vision that he later described as a visit from the angel Gabriel. Gabriel commanded him,
"Recite."
Terrified, Muhammad fled home to Khadija, who comforted him and became the first to believe in his mission. The message was as simple as it was radical. There is only one God, and all people are equal before him. The true measure of a person was not the tribe, their wealth, or their lineage, but righteousness. He called for the rich to give to the poor, for the powerful to show mercy, and for justice to replace vengeance. To a society built on bloodlines, bloodshed, and trade, Muhammad's words were a moral earthquake. As Muhammad's following grew among the poor, among slaves, among the youth, so did the hostility of Mecca's ruling elite. A powerful tribe, the Quraysh, controlled the pilgrimage industry that had arisen around the Kaaba, a stone building hosting 360 pagan idols. Muhammad's calls to reject idol worship and curb exploitation threatened the city's religious authority and commercial lifeblood. His followers were beaten, locked up, and forced into exile. Some fled across the Red Sea to Abyssinia, where the Christian king there granted them asylum. When plots against his life began to circulate, Muhammad and his closest companions secretly escaped north to the oasis town of Yathrib, later to be known as Medina, the city of the Prophet. This journey, the Hijra, marked not only a migration but the beginning of a brand new era, year 1 of the Islamic calendar. To unite the feuding Arab and Jewish tribes of Medina, Muhammad drafted a charter of mutual rights and obligations, the Constitution of Medina, one of history's earliest written social contracts, which united faith, governance, and justice under a single framework. In the year 628, after years of battle between the Quraysh tribe of Mecca and the Muslims of Medina, Muhammad negotiated a treaty that allowed his people to make peaceful pilgrimages to Mecca. The Kaaba there, according to Islamic belief, had been built by Abraham himself and his son Ishmael. It was the first house dedicated to the worship of the one God, and now it was flooded with pagan idols. Muhammad's mission was clear: to restore the Kaaba to its original monotheistic purpose, and to unite all the tribes of Arabia under a single faith, under a single community. Within 2 years, the Quraysh broke the truce. Muhammad already had the numbers needed to take the city by force. Now he had the cause. He marched on the city with an army of 10,000 believers. The Muslim conquest of Mecca was swift and largely bloodless. The Prophet humbly entered the city, pardoned all transgressors, ordered the idols within the Kaaba destroyed, and declared it as a sanctuary for the worship of the one Abrahamic God alone. By the end of that year, most of Arabia had united under Muhammad's rule. Tribes that had once waged endless war against one another now shared a single faith and a common direction. What was once a fractured peninsula became the nucleus of a new civilization, the Ummah. In the year 632, during his farewell pilgrimage, Muhammad stood on the plain of Arafat near Mecca and gave his final sermon to a great assembly. He reminded them that every life, every possession, and every trust was sacred, and that the old tribal vengeance of the past must end. He declared the practice of usury abolished, affirmed the equality of all believers regardless of race or origin, and urged men to honor and protect the rights of women. "O people," he said, Your Lord is one, and your father Adam is one. There is no favor of an Arab over a foreigner, nor a foreigner over an Arab, and neither white skin over black skin, nor black skin over white skin, except by righteousness. Have I not delivered the message?" His followers said, "The messenger of Allah has delivered the message." When Muhammad died in Medina in the year 632, he left no instructions about who should lead the new Muslim community. Those who believed leadership should stay within Muhammad's family supported his son-in-law, Ali ibn Abi Talib. They would later come to be known as the Shi'a faction, short for Shi'at Ali, meaning the party of Ali. Those who believed that leadership should be chosen by the community, a caliph selected for merit rather than bloodline, would later become the Sunni faction from Ahl al-Sunnah, the people of the Prophet's tradition. They supported Abu Bakr, Muhammad's closest friend and father-in-law. In a series of campaigns known as the Ridda Wars, Abu Bakr quickly reunified the Arabian tribes that had fractured after the Prophet's death, establishing the foundations of the early caliphate. In the year 637, the second Rashidun Caliph peacefully negotiated control of Jerusalem away from the Byzantine Empire after months of siege. According to early accounts, when Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab visited the ruins of the old Jewish temple, by then neglected and covered in debris, he began clearing it with his own hands, restoring it as a place of prayer. That act, half history and half legend, marked the rebirth of Jerusalem's most sacred ground. Under the new Muslim management, the Jewish community, which had been banned from the Holy City under Christian rule, was invited back for the first time in 5 centuries. The Christian majority was even permitted to keep its own churches, such as the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, a holy destination for Europeans who could afford the journey east. All that was asked was a modest tax to support the military that secured the borders and roads. Pilgrims of all monotheistic faiths could now come and go as they pleased under Muslim protection. The Christian tourism industry could only enrich their kingdom. In the year 656, civil war erupted within the young Islamic Empire. The third caliph, Uthman ibn Affan, had been assassinated amid accusations of corruption and nepotism. His successor, Ali ibn Abi Talib, faced immediate revolt from such towering figures of the Prophet's own generation as Aisha, Muhammad's widow. They accused Ali of failing to punish Uthman's killers and rallied forces in Basra to demand justice. The two sides met on the plains outside the city in what became known as the Battle of the Camel, named for the beast that carried Aisha's covered litter, or howdah, as she directed her troops from the center of the melee. The clash was brief but devastating, claiming thousands of lives and leaving deep scars across the Muslim community. When the dust settled, Ali's forces were victorious, and Aisha withdrew from public life. The unity that had defined the early Muslim caliphate had fractured. 24 years after that battle, on the parched plains of Karbala, in what is now Iraq, the Prophet's grandson would meet his end. Hussein ibn Ali had refused to recognize the authority of Yazid, the new Umayyad caliph who had turned the once humble caliphate into a hereditary monarchy. Invited by the people of Kufa to lead them in revolt, Hussein set out for Mecca with a small band of family and followers. They were intercepted and surrounded by Yazid's forces. The soldiers cut off the camp's access to the Euphrates River, stranding them under the searing desert sun for several days. When the fighting began, it was no battle at all, but a slaughter of some 4,000 soldiers against less than 100 protesters. Hussein wrote his mission statement prior to his departure from Medina. "I'm not rising as an insolent," he said, "or an arrogant, or a mischief-monger, or as a tyrant. I have risen as I seek to reform the Ummah of my grandfather. I wish to bid the good and forbid the evil, and to follow the way of my grandfather and father." Their bodies were left on the sand. His death and the grief that followed would forever divide the Muslim world. For the Shia, Hussein's martyrdom became a symbol of eternal resistance against tyranny. It kicked off nearly a decade of revolts and civil war. But Abdul Malik ibn Marwan would ultimately restore the Umayyad Caliphate to power. He rebuilt their bureaucracy in the new capital of Damascus, making Arabic their official language and reforming their coinage to break free of Byzantine and Persian imagery. Construction on the Dome of the Rock was completed under Abdul Malik around the year 691 to commemorate the location where the Prophet Muhammad had ascended into heaven just 70 years earlier, within the living memory of some of their fathers. The Al-Aqsa Mosque would rise in the early 700s. These two holy sites together made Jerusalem Islam's third holiest site after Mecca and Medina. For the next 4 centuries, Jerusalem would remain predominantly under Muslim rule, and Jews and Christians both coexisted as protected communities, although periods of tension and persecution would occasionally flare up depending on who was the leader, and the roads leading into the city were seldom free of bandits and local skirmishes. Nearly 4 centuries later, in the year 1064, around 7,000 German pilgrims led by Bishop Gunther of Bamberg were intercepted on their way to Jerusalem by nomadic Bedouin bandits. Our account of this massacre comes from chronicler Lambert of Hersfeld, a Benedictine monk who gathered the story from eyewitnesses. Reports that 2/3 of the pilgrims were massacred were likely highly exaggerated, in addition to all the miracles that supposedly occurred, but a feeling of unease began spreading among Western Christians. A feeling that the Holy Land was slipping into hostile hands. By the mid-11th century, the Byzantine Empire was rich, but overextended, controlling much of Anatolia, the Balkans, and parts of Syria. The Seljuk Turks, originally nomadic warriors from Central Asia, had recently converted to Islam and were now expanding westward under their Sultan Alp Arslan. Perceiving themselves as the defenders of Sunni Islam, they'd already taken control of both Persia and Baghdad. Now they had their eyes on eastern Anatolia, a frontier zone of fortresses, trade routes, and a solid bowl of ethnicities. The only problem? The Byzantine Empire also claimed it. In the year 1071, Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes marched east with an army of 50,000 men to push back the Seljuks and remind the natives who ruled Anatolia. Arslan was campaigning against the Fatimid Caliphate based out of Cairo, Egypt. When he heard Romanos was advancing, he rushed his forces north to meet the emperor near Manzikert. 2 years later, these Seljuk Turks would seize Jerusalem from the Fatimid Caliphate. The Fatimids were Ismaili Shi'a Muslims, a minority sect that claimed descent from Fatima, the Prophet's daughter and Hussein's mother. Each claimed religious legitimacy over the entire Muslim world. The Seljuk Turks controlled the Holy City for the next 3 decades, but ongoing skirmishes with the Fatimids continued to complicate the pilgrimage to Jerusalem for Europeans. More and more Christians returned home with stories of harassment, of heavy tolls, of danger on the roads. To many in Europe, it was starting to seem as though the Turks had closed off Jerusalem for good. These stories would become a rallying cry for the coming Crusades. At the Council of Clermont on November 27, 1095, Pope Urban II stood before a massive crowd in France and called upon the knights of Christendom to reclaim the Holy Land. Although, O sons of God, you have promised more firmly than ever to keep the peace among yourselves and to preserve the rights of the Church, there remains still an important work for you to do. Freshly quickened by the divine correction, you must apply the strength of your righteousness to another matter which concerns you as well as God. For your brethren who live in the East are in urgent need of your help, and you must hasten to give them the aid which has often been promised them. For as most of you have heard, the Turks and Arabs have attacked them, and have conquered the territory of Romania, as far west as the shore of the Mediterranean and the Hellespont, which is called the Arm of St. George. They have occupied more and more of the lands of those Christians, and have overcome them in 7 battles. They have killed and captured many, and have destroyed the churches and devastated the empire. If you permit them to continue thus for a while with impurity, the faithful of God will be much more widely attacked by them. On this account I, or rather the Lord, beseech you, as Christ's heralds, to publish this everywhere, and to persuade all people of whatever rank, foot soldiers and knights, poor and rich, to carry aid promptly to those Christians and to destroy that vile race from the lands of our friends. I say this to those who are present, it meant also for those who are absent. Moreover, Christ commands it. All who die by the way, whether by land or by sea, or in battle against the pagans, shall have immediate remission of sins. With that, Europe's nobility began organizing the First Crusade. A priest named Peter the Hermit also heard the call that day. Wearing simple clothes and riding a donkey, he traveled across France and the Rhineland. By April of 1096, he'd gathered a force of 20,000 to 40,000 Christian peasants, minor knights and their families, including women and children. After years of drought, famine, and disease, the minds of these peasants had been poisoned by the belief that the end of the world was imminent. The crusade was a way to end their suffering and guarantee their placement in heaven. These disorganized bands set out months in advance of the Pope's sanctioned forces, and would come to be called the People's Crusade. As they marched across the Rhineland on their way to Jerusalem, some of these peasant crusaders, stirred up by fanatics like Count Emicho of Leiningen, turned their wrath against the Jewish communities there, with the conviction they were fighting Christ's enemies at home. Thousands of Jews were massacred, forced to convert, or driven to suicide. By late summer, the peasant crusaders had crossed into Seljuk-controlled Anatolia. Emperor Alexios I Komnenos instructed Peter to have his forces wait at the frontier until the main armies arrived. They did not listen. They were slaughtered at Kivitot, just west of the Seljuk capital of Nicaea. Peter the Hermit missed that battle, having returned to Constantinople to join up with the 4 great armies amassing there. That same autumn, those armies began to move. After nearly 3 years of marching and fighting across Anatolia and Syria, the Prince's Crusaders finally reached Jerusalem. The Fatimid Caliphate of Egypt had just recently recaptured the city from the Seljuk Turks, and their garrison of local militias was powerless against the now veteran Crusaders. Those within the city were trapped. The siege lasted for over 5 weeks. The Crusaders breached the northern walls on July 15th, 1099. But now that our men had possession of the walls and towers, wonderful sights were to be seen. Some of our men, and this was more merciful, cut off the heads of our enemies. Others shot them with arrows so that they fell from the towers. Others tortured them longer by casting them into the flames. Piles of heads, hands, and feet were to be seen in the streets of the city. It was necessary to pick one's way over the bodies of men and horses, but these were small matters compared to what happened at the Temple of Solomon, a place where religious services are ordinarily chanted. What happened there? If I tell the truth, it will exceed the powers of your belief. So let it suffice to say this much, at least, that in the temple and porch of Solomon, men rode in blood up to their knees and bridle reins. Indeed, it was a just and splendid judgment of God that this place should be filled with the blood of the unbelievers, since it had suffered so long from their blasphemies. The city was filled with corpses and blood. After the bodies were buried in mass graves outside the city, the Crusaders established the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem. Peter the Hermit was said to have conducted a solemn thanksgiving service at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Godfrey of Bouillon was chosen as ruler, the defender of the Holy Sepulchre. For 9 decades afterward, Crusader kingdoms like Antioch, Tripoli, and Edessa would cling to the eastern Mediterranean, waging intermittent wars with their dispossessed Islamic neighbors. Sultan Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known in the West as Saladin, had organized both Shi'a and Sunni under his banner for the purpose of reclaiming Jerusalem with a unified front. At the Battle of Hattin, near the Sea of Galilee on July 4, 1187, Saladin's forces surrounded and annihilated the Crusader army, capturing the True Cross, Christianity's most sacred relic. Supposedly the cross on which Jesus was actually crucified, and which the Crusaders had used as a battle standard. This was never found again. After the battle, Saladin executed only one man, and he did so personally, the French knight Renaud of Châtillon, who had crossed all bounds against Muslims. Renaud's head rolled across the sand in front of the captured King Guy of Lusignan, who trembled. "It is not the custom of kings to kill kings," Saladin assured him. In September that same year, Saladin laid siege to Jerusalem, which surrendered after less than a month. The Christians there expected to receive the same level of mercy they had offered the Muslims and Jews nearly 9 decades ago, but Saladin spared the city's inhabitants, and even invited back Eastern Orthodox Christians and Jews as it had been under the early Muslim caliphs. The Latin clergy and knights, though, were expelled. The Al-Aqsa Mosque, which the Christians had converted into the Templum Solomonis, the headquarters of the Knights Templar, was restored as a functioning mosque. Saladin cleaned it personally, ordering carpets and lamps to be installed for worship. Pilgrimages flourished again, and for the 7 centuries that followed, Jerusalem would remain almost continuously under Muslim control, alternating between periods of tolerance and factional fighting, stability and chaos. In Bithynia, a rugged region of northwestern Anatolia, a Turkic chieftain named Osman I had carved out an independent mini-state after the Seljuk Sultanate collapsed under Mongol pressure just a few decades earlier. Over the next 100 years, his heirs would expand the burgeoning empire, first into Byzantine territory, with Bursa becoming the first Ottoman capital in 1326, capturing Gallipoli, their first foothold in Europe in 1354, and defeating the Serbs at the Battle of Kosovo in 1389. By 1400, the Ottomans ruled most of Anatolia and the Balkans, and were pressing against the gates of Constantinople itself. The Ottomans captured it at last on May 29, 1453, under Sultan Mehmed II. The last Constantinople emperor reportedly died fighting on the city walls. This marked the end of the 1123-year-old Byzantine Empire. In the year 1517, the Ottoman Empire conquered the Egyptian Mamluk Sultanate. Jerusalem, Damascus, and Cairo all passed to Ottoman control. Jews and Christians would continue to live and worship under imperial protection. Their communities granted security and autonomy alongside their Muslim brothers and sisters. At this time, around 80 to 90% of the population were peasants working land owned by the state. The Sultan granted land revenues to local cavalry officers in exchange for their military service. The peasants underneath these officers paid taxes in the form of grain and livestock, which supported the army and the bureaucracy and the royalty. In other words, bureaucratic feudalism. Cosmopolitan Ottoman cities like Istanbul, Aleppo, and Cairo were hubs for spice, silk, coffee, grain, and slaves. The empire profited greatly from being the middleman between Europe and Asia, although that advantage was, by this time, dwindling, as European ships bypassed the Middle East via the Cape of Good Hope, the route charted by Vasco da Gama. Revenues from trade and customs dwindled, even as a flood of silver from the Spanish colonies in the Americas began devaluing the Ottoman monetary system in the 1570s. The social order that had sustained the Ottoman Empire for centuries was beginning to break down, as soldiers demanded higher pay and prices soared throughout the country. The empire could expand no longer, could extract no more profits. Its borders now came against those of other powerful empires. The old Timar system of state-managed land revenues completely gave way to tax farming by the 1590s. Instead of granting land rights to cavalrymen, the state auctioned off the right to collect taxes to the highest bidder. Usually that meant a wealthy bureaucrat or a merchant with political connections. These new tax farmers squeezed the peasants far harder than the old Sipahis ever had, demanding advance payments and bribes, their rents and their profits, all to maximize the returns on their initial investment. Peasant villages began to empty. Fields went fallow. Dispossessed farmers watching their families starve were unable to find any bootstraps by which to pull themselves up. They instead joined roving bands of unemployed mercenaries and rebels who terrorized the countryside and devastated Anatolia in the early 1600s. The empire remained vast and powerful through all this internal turmoil. At its height during the 17th century, it stretched across Europe, Asia, and Africa, reaching over half the size of the continental United States. But beneath its glittering surface, the economic foundation that had once sustained it was slowly rotting away. Jerusalem, throughout all of this economic upheaval, had remained a relatively quiet provincial backwater, still sacred, still symbolic to all the faiths who had bled and died over it, but economically marginal and politically peripheral. It suffered under increased taxation, unsafe roads, and imperial neglect during the Ottomans' decline, just as everywhere else. Napoleon's Syrian campaign would bypass Jerusalem completely during the French invasion of Egypt in 1798, and when the Egyptians under Muhammad Ali invaded Ottoman Syria in 1831, they ruled over Jerusalem 9 years, until Britain, Russia, and Austria intervened to restore Ottoman rule, drawing European powers directly into Palestinian affairs at the Convention of London in 1840. Britain established a permanent consulate in Jerusalem by 1838. France and Russia followed soon after. This would mark the beginning of European oversight over Ottoman sovereignty in the region, with each nation claiming protection rights over the local religious communities. The first Aliyah, or ascent, began around the year 1881. Roughly 25 to 35,000 Jews would migrate to Ottoman Palestine during this period, many on temporary pilgrimage visas to escape persecution in Russia and Eastern Europe. Why were the Russians so anti-Semitic? To answer that question, look no farther than the Russian Orthodox Church, which had for centuries been indoctrinating its people in the traditional Christian belief that Jews were collectively responsible for the death of Jesus. This belief long predated modern Russia, its origins going beyond medieval Europe. Recall the Rhineland massacre by the People's Crusade in the year 1096. In 1791, Catherine the Great had created the Pale of Settlement, a massive zone stretching across present-day Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, and Lithuania, where Russian Jews were legally allowed to live. This ghettoization isolated millions of Jews from the broader economy and kept them politically and socially powerless. Denied land ownership, many Jews became merchants or innkeepers or moneylenders. These roles made them visible intermediaries between peasants and landlords. Anytime a peasant was crushed by poverty or famine, the ruling class deflected anger toward Jews, portraying them as the exploiters. The state would encourage this scapegoating for centuries to prevent rebellion against the aristocracy. After the assassination of Tsar Alexander II in 1881, a new wave of anti-Jewish pogroms swept across the Russian Empire. Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, Poland, Romania, Yemen. Police and soldiers would join the rioters, or stand aside as mobs burned Jewish neighborhoods, violated their every dignity, and killed indiscriminately. Between 1881 and 1920, thousands of Jews would be murdered in pogroms just like these. When the peasants overthrew the Tsarist aristocracy in March of 1917, the provisional government, then led by liberals and moderate socialists even before Lenin's return from exile, immediately abolished all legal restrictions on Jews. For the first time in Russian history, Jews could live anywhere, own land, and hold public office. Many Jews joined the Bolsheviks that would rise to power that November, seeing communism as a way to destroy the old class system that had kept them in ghettos. Jewish intellectuals and revolutionaries such as Leon Trotsky, Grigory Zinoviev, Lev Kamenev, and Yakov Sverdlov would go on to hold prominent roles in the early Soviet government. But back in the 1880s, fleeing from Russian persecution, Jews would establish the first new agricultural colonies in Palestine in centuries. Petah Tikva, meaning opening of hope, was founded in 1878 about 10 kilometers east of present-day Tel Aviv, on land purchased through Christian intermediaries from absentee Arab landowners near Jaffa. Much of that land was swamp, the kind of land the Ottoman government would allow Jewish immigrants to own. The settlers would later flee the site after a deadly malaria outbreak. The colony was revived in 1883 by Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe, part of the first Aliyah, with the financial backing of Baron Edmund de Rothschild, who funded drainage and irrigation projects. By the early 1900s, Petah Tikva was thriving as the mother of Jewish settlements. The Zionist movement emerged in Europe near the end of the 19th century, bolstered by the publication of Theodor Herzl's pamphlet Der Judenstaat in 1896. Herzl had planned to deliver his pamphlet as a speech to the Rothschild family and their banking dynasty, but Rothschild would ultimately reject Herzl's proposal, which offered up two possible regions for Jewish settlement, Argentina and Palestine. That same year, according to one historical account, Herzl offered to pay £20 million, around $2.2 billion in today's currency, to the Ottoman Sultan to issue a charter for Jews to colonize Palestine, reportedly exclaiming that, without the help of the Zionists, the Turkish economy would not stand a chance of recovery. Sultan Abdul Hamid II told Herzl's interlocutor, Philip de Nowinski, "If Mr. Herzl is as much your friend as you are mine, then advise him not to take another step in this matter. I cannot sell even a foot of land, for it does not belong to me, but to my people. My people have won this empire by fighting for it with their blood, and have fertilized it with their blood. We will again cover it with our blood before we allow it to be wrested away from us." Herzl went on to organize the first Zionist Congress, convening over 3 days in August of 1897 in Switzerland. About 200 delegates attended from 17 countries, plus the press. Here was adopted unanimously the Basel Program, redefining Zionism as a political movement rather than merely a cultural or religious yearning. In a diary entry dated 3 days after the conference, Herzl wrote, "At Basel I founded the Jewish state. If I said this out loud today, I would be greeted by universal laughter. In 5 years, perhaps, and certainly in 50, everyone will recognize it." In 1875, the Ottoman Empire declared bankruptcy on its unsustainable debts to Britain and France, leading to the creation of the Ottoman Public Debt Administration in 1881 to manage its domestic economic policies. Politically, though, they leaned toward Germany for both military and technical aid. Berlin was helping build the Baghdad Railway and training up the Ottoman army with modern tactics. In 1898, Herzl would petition Kaiser Wilhelm II to assist in securing a charter in Syria and Palestine. A draft of his address to the Kaiser in a diary entry dated October 18th reads, "This is the land of our fathers, a land suitable for colonization and cultivation. Your Majesty has seen the country. It cries out for people to work it, and we have among our brethren a frightful proletariat. These people cry out for a land to cultivate. Now we should like to create a new welfare out of these states of distress, of the land and of the people, by the systematic combination of both. We consider our cause so fine, so worthy of the sympathy of the most magnanimous minds, that we are requesting your Imperial Majesty's exalted aid for the project." Sultan Abdul Hamid II granted Herzl an audience in Istanbul on May 17, 1901, and offered him territory in Mesopotamia, but flatly refused to consider Palestine. The Ottoman bureaucracy began tightening immigration rules for foreign Jews in the early 1900s, viewing Zionist land purchases, often financed through European banks, as a colonial Trojan horse. The Turks had ruled the Holy Land for 4 centuries now, but when a teenaged Bosnian Serb assassinated the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, everything changed. By the year 1482, both Bosnia and Herzegovina had been part of the Ottoman Empire, but as their authority and influence declined, Tsar Nicholas I of Russia in 1853 described the Ottoman Empire as the sick man of Europe, just as China was then pejoratively called the sick man of Asia. In the face of this unrest, nationalist movements and European meddling coalesced in the 1878 Congress of Berlin, where Austria-Hungary was granted the right to occupy and administer both provinces under Ottoman suzerainty. In the face of this cruelty, nationalist ideas spread quickly throughout Serbia and Croatia. The Young Turks were mostly young military officers, intellectuals and bureaucrats inspired by the ideals of the Enlightenment, of the French Revolution, of Western constitutionalism. They came to oppose the absolute rule of the Sultan, and their political wing would come to be known as the Committee of Union and Progress. In July of 1908, reformist officers in Macedonia revolted against the Sultan, forcing him to restore the Ottoman constitution and reconvene parliament for the first time in over 3 decades. That revolution concerned the leadership of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Fearing the new Ottoman regime might demand the return of their lands to Ottoman control, Vienna formally annexed Bosnia and Herzegovina in October of 1908, ending Ottoman rule after 400 years. Both Serbia and Russia were infuriated. Secret nationalist societies like Black Hand would emerge a few years later to terrorize the imperialist forces occupying their land. One of these young radicals was Gavrilo Princip, a 19-year-old student born to poor Serbs in western Bosnia. By the time Gavrilo Princip assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand on June 28, 1914, the once mighty Ottoman Empire had already been pushed out of nearly all of Europe. Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, and Montenegro had carved new nations from its ruins during the Balkan Wars. British and French loans propped up its economy, funding railways, ports, and the Sultan's lavish court, while leaving the empire bound to its creditors. Its army, though large, was outdated and demoralized. The assassination set off a chain reaction. On July 5th, Austria-Hungary sought the support of Germany against Serbia in case of Russian military intervention. The Germans agreed, and Vienna declared war on Serbia on July 28th. 3 days later, Russia mobilized for war. Germany declared war on Russia on August 1st, and France and Britain would join the war shortly after. Europe was about to catch fire, and the leaders of the Ottoman Empire knew that their regime would not survive another generation without powerful allies. Just on the eve of war, Ottoman diplomats had approached both Britain and France, seeking an alliance. Both nations refused. The Ottomans didn't have enough to offer, and Russia, already a part of their alliance, had determined to control the Turkish Straits for access to the warm waters of the Mediterranean, a national ambition since the reign of Catherine the Great over a century ago. In 1898, Kaiser Wilhelm II had visited the Ottoman Empire and declared to the Sultan Abdullah Hamid II that Germany was the protector of 300 million Muslims. 16 years later, on August 2, 1914, diplomats representing the Young Turk government signed a treaty with Germany. By November, the Ottomans had joined the Central Powers in the Great War. It was an aging empire's last bid for survival in a world about to be reorganized. But why this war? Why now? Did a 19-year-old's bullets really have to start all of this? Beneath their fluttering flags and fancy uniforms, nearly every empire was drowning in its own ambition. Every major power was living on borrowed money from other major powers. Banks were leveraged to the hilt, treasuries dependent on endless expansion of colonies, of markets of profit. By the dawn of the 20th century, the world had been carved up. There were no new continents to plunder, no fresh frontiers for easy capital to sustain the growth these empires had come to depend on. Capitalism itself had reached a breaking point. Conquest had become too expensive, and profit too scarce to sustain peace. The Great War wasn't fought for civilization or democracy or justice. It was fought because imperialist capitalism depended on it. By November of 1915, with the Great War raging across Eurasia, Sir Mark Sykes of Britain and François-Georges Picot of France were already secretly negotiating how to divide the Arab provinces of the collapsing Ottoman Empire. They drew lines across a map of the Middle East with a ruler. France would control modern-day Syria and Lebanon, the Blue Zone. Britain would take the Red Zone, southern Mesopotamia, including Baghdad as well as the ports of Haifa and Acre, to connect their planned rail route from India via Basra. The rest of Palestine would be under a vague form of international administration. Jerusalem was sacred to all 3 major Abrahamic faiths, which had coexisted there in relative stability, and no singular power wanted to risk global outrage by claiming it for themselves. To keep Russia committed to the war, Tsar Nicholas II was secretly promised Istanbul, once the great capital of the Byzantine Empire, now a bargaining chip. Russia would also receive Bosphorus and Dardanelles, the Turkish Straits that his country had long sought. Although that bit of the deal fell apart after the Bolshevik Revolution in November of 1917. When the revolutionaries seized control of the government and discovered the secret treaty, they revealed its contents to the public, humiliating the British and confirming Arab suspicions that the Allies had never intended to grant them the self-determination promised in earlier correspondences. Those borders sliced arbitrarily through tribal territories, languages, and religious sects, ignoring altogether the complex ethnic and religious geography of the region. It was the ultimate expression of imperial arrogance, but that wasn't even the worst of it. On November 2nd, the British government issued the Balfour Declaration. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. That was a letter from British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour to Lord Rothschild, a leader of the British Jewish community. British forces led by General Edmund Allenby captured Jerusalem just 5 weeks later. He famously dismounted his horse and entered on foot out of respect for the Holy City. The Great War ended less than a year later on November 11, 1918, when Germany agreed to an armistice after 4 years of brutal, industrial-scale warfare that had devastated Europe. By that time, the Central Powers were collapsing. Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire had already surrendered, and Germany faced revolution at home as its people, exhausted and starving under a naval blockade, demanded peace. The Allied forces, bolstered by fresh American troops and resources, had pushed the German army back on the Western Front. The armistice, signed in a railway carriage in Compiègne, France, effectively halted the fighting. Though a formal peace would not come until the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, which imposed harsh reparations and territorial losses on Germany, sowing the seeds of the next Great War. And on July 24, 1922, the League of Nations, founded just 2 years earlier out of the victors of the Great War, granted Britain full mandate authority over occupied Palestine. This turned it into just another colony of London's in all but name. The area east of the Jordan River became Transjordan under Emir Abdullah, the son of Sharif Hussein of Mecca. The area to the west became mandatory Palestine, or just Palestine, which today includes Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza. The British mandate over Palestine would eventually become politically impossible for the aging empire. The Second World War had left Britain's cities in ruins. By 1947, the Labour government under Prime Minister Clement Attlee and Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin wanted to wash their hands of old imperial entanglements and focus on restoring the home front. This was the same year India gained its independence, guided in part spiritually by Mahatma Gandhi. The United Nations, formed just 2 years earlier out of the victors of the Second World War, proposed Resolution 181, the partitioning of the Palestinian territory into separate Jewish and Arab states, with the city of Jerusalem alone remaining under international administration. Jewish leaders accepted the proposal. The Arab Higher Committee boycotted the process altogether, arguing that the rights of Palestinian Arabs were self-evident and could not continue to be subject to investigation. About 1.1 million Arab Muslims and 100,000 Arab Christians were already living in Palestine, and many of the 600,000 Jews living there had only arrived during the previous 30 years under the British mandate, especially in the aftermath of the Holocaust. Hundreds of thousands of Jews who had lost nearly everything were displaced in camps across Europe under horrific conditions. But immigration into the US and Western Europe was severely restricted. According to a 1939 Gallup poll, nearly 2/3 of Americans opposed admitting 10,000 Jewish refugee children from Germany. Assistant Secretary of State Breckinridge Long, in an internal State Department memo in 1940, wrote, "We can delay and effectively stop for a temporary period of indefinite length the number of immigrants into the United States by simply advising our consuls to put every obstacle in the way." U.S. President Harry S. Truman would reveal his own thoughts in a diary entry written July 21, 1947. "The Jews, I find, are very, very selfish," he writes. "They care not how many Estonians, Latvians, Finns, Poles, Yugoslavs, or Greeks get murdered or mistreated as displaced persons as long as the Jews get special treatment. Yet when they have power, physical, financial, or political, neither Hitler nor Stalin has anything on them for cruelty or mistreatment to the underdog. Put an underdog on top and it makes no difference whether his name is Russian, Jewish, Negro, Management, Labor, Mormon, Baptist, he goes haywire. I've found very, very few who remember their past condition when prosperity comes. Look at the Congress's attitude on displaced persons, and they all come from displaced persons." For many families, entering into Palestine illegally became their only hope at finding safety and dignity. They had no part in the plan that the leaders of the United Nations proposed in 1947, and neither did the Arabs, who for generations had lived upon the very land that was being negotiated out from under their feet. The UN wanted to grant the Jewish state about 55% of the total country, including much of the fertile coastal plain, as well as the strategic Negev desert that gave access to the Red Sea. The Arab state, meanwhile, was to be fragmented into 3 disconnected regions sliced apart by Jewish corridors. It was exceedingly clear which peoples the West had chosen as the winner. Arab protests and labor strikes began in December, as militias from either side clashed throughout urban centers and countryside. British forces watched from the sidelines as civil war engulfed the country all around them. On April 9, 1948, Jewish fighters slaughtered over 100 Palestinians, including women and children, in Deir Yassin, a small village about 5 kilometers west of Jerusalem. Less than a month later, Kfar Etzion, south of Jerusalem, was overrun by Transjordanian soldiers and Palestinian fighters. 127 Jewish defenders were killed. News of the horrors reached Arabs across the region, triggering a mass exodus. By spring, many Arab villages had been depopulated or captured by Jewish paramilitary forces. On May 14th, just one day after the Kfar Etzion massacre, the same day Britain's mandate was set to expire at midnight, Zionist socialist David Ben-Gurion read the Declaration of the Establishment of the State of Israel at the Tel Aviv Museum. Exiled from Palestine, he said, the Jewish people remained faithful to it in all the countries of their dispersion, never ceasing to pray and hope for their return and restoration of their national freedom. In recent decades, they returned in their masses. They reclaimed a wilderness, revived their language, built cities and villages, and established a vigorous and ever-growing community, with its own economic and cultural life. They sought peace, yet were ever prepared to defend themselves. They brought blessings of progress to all inhabitants of the country. Within hours, the US recognized Israel de facto. Israel ended up controlling not only the 55% of the land from the UN's original, never agreed upon proposal, but also all that it had claimed during the Civil War amid the exodus of Palestinian Arabs escaping the violence. On May 15, 1948, the neighboring Arab states of Egypt, Transjordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq all invaded Israel at once, many for their own national aims as much as to protect Palestinians. The Civil War had transformed overnight into an international war. Urban warfare, guerrilla tactics, massacres, and ethnic cleansing combined to take the lives of 6,000 Jews and between 10 and 15,000 Arabs. A letter to the editors of the New York Times dated December 4, 1948 reads, "Among the most disturbing political phenomena of our times is the emergence in the newly created State of Israel of the Freedom Party, a political party closely akin in its organization, methods, political philosophy, and social appeal to the Nazi and fascist parties. It was formed out of the membership and following of the former Irgun Zavai Leumi, a right-wing chauvinist organization in Palestine. The current visit of Menachem Begin, leader of this party, to the United States is obviously calculated to give the impression of American support for his party in the coming Israeli elections, and to cement political ties with conservative Zionist elements in the United States. Several Americans of national repute have lent their names to welcome his visit. It is inconceivable that those who oppose fascism throughout the world, if correctly informed as to Mr. Begin's political record and perspectives, could add their names and support to the movement he represents." That letter was co-signed by such figures as Hannah Arendt, author of The Origins of Totalitarianism, and Albert Einstein, physicist and author of an essay called Why Socialism, that you can read online for free. The United Nations mediator, Swedish Count Folke Bernadotte, was assassinated in Jerusalem on September 17, 1948, by members of the Stern Gang. He had proposed a fairer settlement for Palestinians as well as refugee repatriation. His plan died with him. Bernadotte's deputy, American Ralph Bunche, brokered separate armistice agreements between the warring nations between February and July of 1949. He earned himself the Nobel Peace Prize, becoming the first black laureate. Egypt could keep occupying the Gaza Strip like they were already doing. They would administer its stateless residents under military rule. Transjordan annexed East Jerusalem and the West Bank, renaming itself the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, now that it controlled land on both sides of the river. Palestinians there were granted Jordanian citizenship for as long as Jordan could control the region. Israel got to keep all the rest, including West Jerusalem. This meant Israel now controlled about 78% of former mandatory Palestine, half again as much as the UN had originally proposed. Israelis called this conflict the War of Independence. Palestinians call it the Nakba, or catastrophe. No Palestinian state emerged. Around 700,000 Palestinians had fled or were expelled during the wars. They left behind hundreds of villages that were later destroyed or resettled by Jewish immigrants. In the following years, about 800,000 more Jews would flee or be expelled from surrounding Arab countries amid retaliatory violence. Many of them would resettle in Israel. It was a haunting echo of the story that was still playing out between India and Pakistan, a crisis also molded by British hands. Not one of the Arab states recognized Israel as a sovereign nation. Cross-border raids and retaliations became routine, especially along the Egyptian and Jordanian frontiers, which were now flooded with stateless Palestinians who would spend the next several generations being squeezed into a smaller and smaller box. In the year 1956, Egypt's Arab socialist president, Gamal Abdel Nasser, sought Western financing to build the Aswan High Dam, a massive public works project that would allow Egypt to control the Nile's floods, irrigate farmland, and electrify the country. But the World Bank's loan came with conditions. First, harsh austerity policies at home. Second, Egypt had to remain within the Western economic and defense orbit. When Nasser didn't play along, the United States and the World Bank abruptly withdrew their loan offer that July. And on July 26, the Egyptian president nationalized the Suez Canal, the main shipping route between Europe and Asia, which carried about 2/3 of Europe's oil imports at the time. All company profits, which had for decades been flowing into the bank accounts of British and French shareholders who had never even seen the thing, let alone had a hand in its construction, now went directly to the Egyptian state. The Aswan Dam was funded and built by the end of 1970. Unfortunately, this presented a problem for the canal's previous owners. So in October, the following people secretly met in a private villa in Sèvres, a suburb west of Paris near Versailles. For the Israeli delegation, Prime Minister and Defense Minister David Ben-Gurion, Director General of the Ministry of Defense and future Prime Minister Shimon Peres, and Chief of Staff of the Israeli Defense Forces Moshe Dayan. For the French delegation, French Foreign Minister Christian Pineau, Defense Minister Maurice Bourges-Manori, Chief of Naval Staff Admiral Henry Nomi, and Colonel André Beaufret. For the British delegation, Patrick Dean, legal advisor to the Foreign Office and representing the British government, and Denis Greenhill, a Foreign Office official. Back in London, via secure channels, Prime Minister Anthony Eden and Foreign Secretary Selwyn Lloyd would approve the plan. Here's the plan. Israel would invade Egypt from the east, claiming self-defense from President Nasser's forces. Britain and France would then issue an ultimatum to both sides to stop fighting and withdraw from the Canal Zone or else. And when Egypt inevitably refused to stop fighting the Israeli invaders on their own soil, Britain and France would use that refusal as an excuse to intervene militarily, occupy the canal, and topple Nasser to get their canal back. This whole conspiracy came to be known as the Sèvres Protocol, signed October 24, 1956, by Ben-Gurion, Pineau, and Dean for their respective governments. When reports of the arrangement leaked just days later, Prime Minister Eden would deny its existence, sending Dean back to France the very next day to collect all copies and leave no trace. But Pineau refused to comply since the Israeli diplomats had already left the country. For Eden, the existence of the protocol was a catastrophe, a smoking gun that exposed the full extent of collusion between Britain, France, and Israel.
Israel's parliament becomes the focus of world concern as the tension in the Middle East mounts hourly, culminating in an attack by Israel on Egypt, an attack which reaches deep into Egyptian territory.
Israel invaded as planned on October 29th, launching Operation Kadesh across the Sinai Peninsula. At the UN Security Council the next day, the British and French vetoed an American-sponsored resolution calling for Israel's withdrawal. Eisenhower threatened to sell U.S. reserves of the pound sterling and to cut off loans to the Brits. The UN General Assembly met on November 2nd and voted overwhelmingly for a ceasefire before the canal could be captured. Britain and France were humiliated. Their retreat marked the conclusion of their imperial dominance in the Middle East. From this moment forward, only the United States and the Soviet Union would be sitting on opposite sides of the chessboard. Arab resentment over imperial interference would spread through universities and the working class, fueling a new wave of nationalist defiance across the region. By the early 1960s, a new generation of displaced Palestinians began organizing to reclaim their homeland, independent of the Arab regimes that had so far failed them. The Palestine Liberation Organization, or PLO, was formally established in May of 1964, under the sponsorship of Egypt's President Nasser, intended to coordinate Palestinian political and military efforts. Meanwhile, an underground movement called Fatah, founded in 1959 by Yasser Arafat and other activists in exile, was gaining strength through guerrilla organizing and clandestine operations. Fatah's philosophy was simple yet radical: Palestinians must liberate Palestine by themselves, through armed struggle, not by waiting for Arab armies or diplomacy. Its members must reject reliance on Arab regimes like Egypt, Syria, or Jordan, all of which had their own interests in the conflict. The movement itself envisioned a secular, democratic state in all of historic Palestine, one where Muslims, Christians, and Jews could live together, rather than a theocratic or ethnic state. At the United Nations, Yasser Arafat would famously address the General Assembly in 1974, declaring, "Today I have come bearing an olive branch and a freedom fighter's gun. Do not let the olive branch fall from my hand. I repeat, do not let the olive branch fall from my hand." Over the next few years, Fatah would eclipse Egypt's influence over the PLO, transforming it from a body controlled by Arab states into a truly independent Palestinian liberation movement. By 1967, relationships between Israel, Syria, Egypt, and Jordan were beginning to collapse once more. Syria and Israel were clashing over water rights. Nasser had signed a mutual defense pact with Jordan, following an earlier one with Syria. And Egypt had received information from the Soviet Union that Israeli troops were amassing on the Syrian border. Nasser closed the Straits of Tiran, cutting off Israel's southern maritime route, and mobilized his own troops in Sinai to head off the perceived invasion. On June 5th, Israel, fearing that their neighbors were mobilizing for another invasion, launched Operation Focus, a surprise air assault that destroyed most of Egypt's air force on the ground before any planes could even take off. Over the next 5 days, Israeli forces rolled through the unprepared Arab defenses with stunning speed and coordination. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians fled the regions to escape the violence again. Refugee camps in Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria swelled. By the end of the 6-day war, Israel's territory had tripled.
אנחנו יושבים על הרכב שצופה אל העיר העתיקה. אנחנו נהיה הראשונים להיכנס אליה. לנוע אל השער. אנחנו הולכים ומעמיקים לתוך העיר העתיקה. הר הבית בידינו, כאן תבין, הר הבית בידינו. לראות את ההתקפה, כל הכבוד.
Israel now controlled all of Jerusalem as well as Golan Heights, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip. Over 1 million Palestinian Arabs had populated these areas, and instead of annexing these regions or granting the people citizenship and rights, Israel established military administration, arguing that the land's final status would be decided in peace negotiations. Only those negotiations never came. The speed and decisiveness of the Israeli victory in the 6-day war humiliated many Muslims who had believed until then that God favored their cause. They had lost not only their armies and their territories, but also faith in their leaders, in their countries, and in themselves. The profound appeal of Islamic fundamentalism in Egypt and elsewhere was born in this shocking debacle. A newly strident voice was heard in the mosques. The voice said that they had been defeated by a force far larger than the tiny country of Israel. God had turned against the Muslims. The only way back to him was to return to the pure religion. The voice answered despair with a simple formulation: Islam is the solution. Soon Israel began building settlements in the occupied territories, including military outposts and Nahal paramilitary farming communities. The first civilian settlement in the West Bank, the repopulated Kfar Etzion, was re-established in September of 1967, followed by others in the Jordan Valley and Golan Heights. These settlements were illegal under the Fourth Geneva Convention, which Israel denies, insisting that the territories are actually disputed, not occupied. When leaders of the 8 Arab states met in Khartoum, Sudan, from August 29th to September 1st to decide how to respond to Israel's overwhelming victory, they issued the Khartoum Resolution, the famous 3 no's. No peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, no negotiations with Israel. On November 22nd, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 242 calling for Israel to withdraw from the territories it now occupied, and to give recognition of every state's right to live in peace within secure borders. But while the French version of the resolution did include very clearly the words "des territoires occupés," from the occupied territories, the binding English text merely said "from territories," leaving it ambiguous for Israel to interpret what was meant by territories. We did not say there should be a withdrawal from all the territories. The wording of the resolution was very carefully chosen, said Lord Caradon, the UK ambassador to the UN. By 1970, tensions between the Palestine Liberation Organization and the Jordanian monarchy had reached a breaking point. From bases inside Jordan, Palestinian guerrillas were launching cross-border attacks into Israel, drawing Israeli retaliation and threatening King Hussein's fragile rule. When Palestinian factions began operating almost as a state within his state, Hussein's army struck back. What followed was a brutal civil war known as Black September, in which thousands of Palestinians were killed as the Jordanian army crushed the PLO's militias. By the autumn of 1971, Yasser Arafat and his fighters were expelled from Jordan entirely, forced to relocate their headquarters to Beirut, Lebanon, a country already teetering toward its own civil war. 2 years later, on October 6, 1973, the Jewish holy day of Yom Kippur, Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack to reclaim the Sinai Peninsula and Golan Heights. Their armies surged across the Suez Canal and into Israeli positions, catching Israel unprepared. Though Israel repelled the invasion, it suffered severe casualties and a profound psychological shock. Within days, the Israeli defense forces were running dangerously low on tanks, shells, and aircraft munitions. As the Soviet Union airlifted supplies to Egypt and Syria, Israel appealed urgently to the Americans. On October 12th, President Richard Nixon and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger launched Operation Nickelgrass, dispatching C-5 Galaxies and C-141 Starlifters that carried over 26,000 tons of weapons and supplies over the next 32 days, from M60 tanks to spare jet engines and artillery shells. The airlift allowed Israel to regain air superiority, cross the Suez Canal, and encircle the Egyptian Third Army by the war's end. A UN ceasefire took effect on October 25th, 19 days after the start of the conflict. To the Arab world, America had unmistakably chosen a side at long last. In retaliation, Arab members of OPEC, led by Saudi Arabia, declared an oil embargo against the United States and other Western supporters of Israel. The result was the 1973 oil crisis, gas shortages, rationing, and an economic shock that combined inflation with high unemployment, a new monster called stagflation, crippling the Western economies. The crisis would even push Washington to pursue energy independence, culminating in the creation of the Department of Energy in 1977. Also in 1973, but half a world away, a democratically elected socialist government under Salvador Allende had nationalized Chile's copper mines and promised power to its workers. Covert CIA operations over the previous 3 years had destabilized Chile's economy, leading to a military coup led by General Augusto Pinochet, whose forces would shell the presidential palace that year. Allende died during the assault. U.S. National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger oversaw the operations and personally briefed President Richard Nixon as Chile succumbed to a brutal, right-wing authoritarian dictatorship. In a June 27, 1970 meeting, Kissinger would tell Nixon, "I don't see why we need to stand by and watch a country go communist because of the irresponsibility of its own people." 1973 was also the year that the Nobel Peace Prize was jointly awarded to Kissinger and Vietnamese nationalist and senior Communist Party official Le Duc Tha. The two men had negotiated the Paris Peace Accords meant to end direct American involvement in the Vietnam War. Le Duc Tha refused the prize, saying there was no peace in Vietnam. Indeed, the war between the South and the North would continue another 2 years. Kissinger accepted the prize, but declined to attend the Oslo ceremony amid global protests. In the aftermath of the Yom Kippur War, Kissinger, ever the master of quiet power, began his famous shuttle diplomacy between Arab capitals and Israel. Over the next 2 years, he would broker disengagement agreements between Israel and Egypt and between Israel and Syria, redrawing the regional map and realigning the politics of the modern Middle East. These talks would ultimately lay the groundwork for the Camp David Accords of 1978, hosted by President Jimmy Carter at his presidential retreat in Maryland. After 13 days of negotiation, the Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin agreed to 2 frameworks. The first framework established the basis for peace between Egypt and Israel. Egypt would regain the Sinai Peninsula in exchange for recognizing Israel's statehood, making Sadat the first Arab leader to do so, and leading to a shunning from the Arab League that would persist an entire decade. The second framework proposed Palestinian autonomy in the West Bank and Gaza, but these talks soon collapsed. The Israelis had envisioned administrative self-rule, not sovereignty. The Palestine Liberation Organization, meanwhile, headquartered in Beirut and recognized by the United Nations since 1974 as the only voice of the Palestinian people under the chairmanship of Yasser Arafat, was excluded from the conversation. Both Israel and the United States had classified the PLO as a terrorist organization. Meanwhile, Jewish settlements in the occupied territories continued to grow, driven by Gush Emunin, Bloc of the Faithful, an ultranationalist religious movement committed to colonizing all the lands of historical Palestine. Daniel Weiss, born in Mandatory Palestine in 1945, emerged as a prominent figure, helping to establish new settlements throughout the 1970s and 1980s. She appears prominently in Louis Theroux, The Settlers, a harrowing documentary about the ongoing Israeli settler project, available to stream for free on filmsforaction.org.
You will witness how Jews go to Gaza and Arabs disappear from Gaza. They lost the right to stay in this holy place. Please go.
In 1980, Israel's parliament, the Knesset, passed the Jerusalem Law, formally annexing East Jerusalem, which it had already informally annexed after the Six-Day War of 1967. Prime Minister Menachem Begin declared in that moment that Jerusalem, complete and united, is the capital of Israel. The world condemned this move. United Nations Security Council Resolution 478 called the annexation null and void and a violation of international law, urging member states to withdraw their embassies from the city. 14 nations voted in favor, 0 against, with only the United States abstaining. After the embassies left, the State of Israel remained. Still, to this day, no other country except the United States recognizes Jerusalem as Israel's capital. The European Community, a precursor to the EU, issued the Venice Declaration in June of that same year, further condemning Israel and reaffirming the right of Palestinians to self-determination. For Palestinians living in the shadow of the old city walls of East Jerusalem, the declaration was not just political, it was personal. Overnight, their birthplace had been absorbed into a state that denied them citizenship. On June 6, 1982, following an assassination attempt on Israel's ambassador in London by a splinter Palestinian group outside of Arafat's control, Israel launched a full-scale invasion into Lebanon, the PLO's home since being expelled from Jordan during Black September 11 years earlier. The stated objective was to create a 40-kilometer security zone in southern Lebanon to protect Israel's northern towns, but the real objective was to destroy the PLO militarily and install a pro-Israeli Christian government under Bashir Gemayel. Israeli tanks rolled all the way to Beirut, besieging the entire city for 10 weeks. An estimated 17,000 Lebanese and Palestinians, mostly civilians, were killed during the campaign. On September 14th, Bashir Gemayel, then president-elect of Lebanon, was assassinated. The assassin was a member of the Syrian Social Nationalist Party, which opposed Gemayel's alliance with Israel. This shattered Israel's plan to install a friendly Christian government in Beirut and provided the pretext for Israeli forces to re-enter. They sealed off the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps and allowed Lebanese Christian militias to enter. Over the next 36 to 48 hours, these men systematically slaughtered civilians while Israeli forces surrounded the area and fired flares at night to keep the camps illuminated. We went back to see dead bodies explode as they were being removed because the phalangists and Israelis placed mines underneath them. I remember the smell. It was so strong, and it stayed for a week, even though they sprayed the camp to get rid of it. Death toll estimates range from 700 to 3,500 people. The world watched in horror as these events unfolded. President Ronald Reagan called it an act of barbarism. The UN General Assembly declared the massacre an act of genocide. 400,000 Israeli citizens, roughly 10% of the population, marched on Tel Aviv to demand accountability. The Kahan Commission would later find Defense Minister Ariel Sharon indirectly responsible, forcing him to resign. The PLO, meanwhile, was forced to flee to Tunisia. On December 8, 1987, a military truck in Gaza's Jabalia refugee camp struck a civilian car at a checkpoint, killing 4 Palestinian laborers returning from work in Israel. What followed was not just anger. Thousands attended the funerals the next day. Those funerals erupted into protests. Those protests spread across Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem within days. This was the First Intifada, a spontaneous uprising not orchestrated by the PLO. The uprising would persist until 1993. Thousands of Palestinians, many of them teenagers, faced Israeli soldiers with nothing but stones. Soldiers were instructed to break the bones of protesters to discourage resistance. Over 1,200 Palestinians were killed and tens of thousands injured in the first years of the Intifada. Hamas, or the Islamic Resistance Movement, was founded in December of this year at the very start of the Intifada, emerging out of the Gaza branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, a Sunni Islamist movement that had existed in Palestine since the 1940s. While the secular PLO and its dominant faction Fatah advocated for Palestinian nationalism and eventually a two-state solution, Hamas fused Islamist ideology with armed resistance, rejecting any recognition of Israel's right to exist and appealing to poorer Palestinians disillusioned with the perceived corruption and compromises of their political body. Its 1988 charter called for the establishment of an Islamic state in all of historic Palestine. In light of this uprising, from exile in Algiers, the Palestine National Council declared the establishment of the State of Palestine. For the first time, the PLO implicitly recognized Israel's right to exist by accepting the two-state formula of UN Resolution 242. Over 100 nations recognized Palestine diplomatically. The United States and Israel alone did not. Still, this would mark a turning point, a shift from armed struggle to diplomacy, as Israel began to recognize that occupation could not be sustained by force alone, and the center of Palestinian politics shifted from exiled leadership abroad to the occupied territories themselves. After the Gulf War in 1991, U.S. President George H.W. Bush and the Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev hosted another round of peace talks at the Royal Palace in Madrid. For the first time, Israeli and Palestinian representatives sat in the same room, face to face, to attempt diplomacy. Palestine's chief negotiator, Haider Abdel-Shafi, a respected physician from Gaza, insisted that land for peace must include East Jerusalem and an end to settlement expansion. Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir was skeptical. He was a member of the right-wing Likud party and former leader in the militant Stern Gang in the 1940s. Recall the Deir Yassin massacre in 1948, as well as the assassination of the Swedish pro-Palestinian UN ambassador that same year. The 1991 conference produced ultimately no treaty, but it opened the door that had never been opened before. And in Israel's elections the following year, the Likud would lose control of the Knesset, Israel's national parliament and sole legislative body, dropping from 40 of the 120 seats to 32 after years of economic hardship, settlement expansion, and diplomatic isolation. The Labour Party, led by Yitzhak Rabin, would win 44 seats, enough to form a center-left coalition government. Prime Minister Rabin would prioritize diplomacy over occupation, beginning unofficial back-channel peace talks with the PLO early the very next year. The two sides would secretly draft what would become known as the Declaration of Principles on Interim Self-Government Arrangements. This would later be revealed to the world as the Oslo Accords. On September 13, 1993, Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and PLO Chairman Yasser Arafat stood on the White House lawn with U.S. President Bill Clinton. Before the cameras of the world, they shook hands, a gesture that seemed to promise an end to generations of bloodshed. Israel recognized the PLO as the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. The PLO renounced violence and accepted Israel's right to exist. The Palestinian Authority was created to govern parts of the West Bank and Gaza, a transitional self-government meant to last only 5 years while final status negotiations took place on issues like borders, refugees, and the status of Jerusalem. Hope returned to the region for the first time in centuries, but that hope was tentative and fragile. You could barely whisper it. It was July of 1994. After 27 years, Yasser Arafat returned from exile to lead the newly established Palestinian Authority headquarters in Gaza City. The Gaza Strip presents a formidable challenge to Arafat's ambitions, to Palestinian hopes for both prosperity and democracy, and to peace in the Middle East. More than 850,000 people, many of them refugees from old Arab villages in what is now Israel, are crammed in its 140 square miles. Living conditions here are squalid. Many people have not been employed for years and barely subsist. This poverty and desperation bred the original Palestinian Revolution, then the Intifada, the 1987 uprising against Israeli occupation that ultimately led to the peace accord between Israel and the PLO. Arafat, escorted to the Gaza border by Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak, walked across at Rafah at mid-afternoon, gesturing with a V for victory sign. He dropped to his knees to kiss the ground and to pray. He was quickly engulfed by scores of Palestinian police officers, disappearing for a while, his black and white headdress barely visible, before the officers raised him aloft to the cheers of jubilant supporters. Tens of thousands of Palestinians lined the roads chanting his name. In October, King Hussein made Jordan the second Arab state to make peace with Israel, again with mediation from Bill Clinton at the border between the two nations. This ended 46 years of official hostilities and opened trade and tourism for both nations. In December of that year, Rabin, Arafat, and Israeli Foreign Minister Shimon Peres shared the Nobel Peace Prize for the Oslo Accords and the Jordan-Israel Peace Treaty. But beneath the celebrations, Israeli settlements continued to grow, particularly around East Jerusalem and the West Bank. For many Palestinians, daily life changed little, if at all. Still the same Palestinian checkpoints, restrictions on movement, and economic dependency. The occupation had not ended. This was not sovereignty. It was a temporary administrative state, still under military occupation, that would only last until negotiations broke down with their oppressors. And it was only a matter of time. Prime Minister Rabin's government had signed the Oslo II Accord in September of 1995, transferring yet more Palestinian cities to the newly created Palestinian Authority. As Israel withdrew from parts of the West Bank, settler leaders, ultranationalist rabbis, and right-wing Likud politicians, including rising star Benjamin Netanyahu, accused Rabin of selling out the nation. Public rallies featured posters depicting Rabin in a Nazi uniform, with chants of "Rabin is a traitor." On November 4th, 1995, at the Kings of Israel Square in Tel Aviv, during a mass rally attended by tens of thousands, Rabin stood on stage and sang Shir la Shalom, or Song for Peace. After leaving the stage, he walked through the crowd toward his car. Among the people there was Yigal Amir, a 25-year-old Israeli law student and religious extremist. He stepped out from the crowd and fired 3 bullets into Rabin's back. To this day, Israelis mark this as one of the darkest moments in their history. The first killing of an Israeli leader by another Israeli, a trauma that exposed the deep ideological fracture within the nation between the left and the right. Shimon Peres became acting prime minister, vowing to continue the peace process. But Rabin's death shattered national confidence. Israelis grew fearful and divided again. Palestinians lost their most credible negotiating partner. Hamas at this time was positioning itself as the religious, militant conservative alternative to Arafat's secular national socialist diplomacy. By 1996, Hamas had become the chief rival to both the PLO and the Palestinian Authority, rejecting Oslo and launching suicide bombings that targeted Israeli civilians. Israel answered with retaliatory raids, airstrikes, and mass arrests, collective punishment on a massive scale. What little trust had been built through years of negotiation was consumed by violence, suspicion, and grief, as each side retreated into its own pain, its own wounded historical narrative. That same year, Benjamin Netanyahu entered the national spotlight. He promised explicitly to slow down the peace process and expand Israeli settlements. Capitalizing on the Israeli people's fear of suicide bombings, Netanyahu accused his opponents of endangering national security. He narrowly defeated Shimon Peres in the 1996 election, 50.4% to 49.5%. Once in power, he was true to his word. Under Netanyahu's government, many of Rabin's commitments were frozen. Settlement construction was accelerated, especially around Jerusalem. Again and again, Israel would demand that the Palestinians prove their collective worthiness for peace through total security cooperation. For ordinary Palestinians, daily life under occupation hardened once more. More checkpoints, more demolitions, more humiliation, as any last vestiges of hope vanished under the heavy boots of the new right-wing occupiers. When he met with Clinton for the first time in the summer of 1996, Netanyahu tried to sway him toward the Zionist position. Joe Lockhart was the White House spokesman. He described the Israeli prime minister as one of the most obnoxious individuals you're going to come into. Just a liar and a cheat. He could open his mouth and you could have no confidence that anything that came out of it was the truth. Clinton himself would say after the meeting, "Who the f*** does he think he is? Who's the f***ing superpower here?" In October of 1998, Clinton would try once more to restart the Oslo peace process. He brought both Benjamin Netanyahu and Yasser Arafat, along with a gravely ill King Hussein of Jordan, to the Wye River plantation in Maryland. The US president stood to the side as Netanyahu and Arafat signed yet another agreement for peace. Israel ceded just 13% of the West Bank. But the spirit of compromise was dead and gone. Netanyahu returned to Israel to a chorus of fury from both the left and right wing. The left accused him of sabotaging peace. The right accused him of conceding too much. Benny Begin, son of Menachem Begin and a prominent figure within Netanyahu's own party, resigned in protest to the deal. By the following year, Netanyahu's coalition had fractured. Opposition parties and even some former allies among the Likud party were preparing for a vote of no confidence. Netanyahu called for early elections that May, giving the public a clear choice. Choose security or surrender. That was his campaign's central message. Only Israelis by this time were tired of political gridlock and they wanted results, not rhetoric. So they voted decisively for Ehud Barak of the Labour Party to try to turn things around once more. By the summer of 2000, the peace process was running on fumes. President Bill Clinton once more invited Israel and Palestine to the same table, hoping against hope to secure a legacy peace deal before the end of his presidency. Barak and Arafat met at Camp David, hoping for one final breakthrough. For 2 weeks they negotiated behind closed doors, but decades of mistrust couldn't be bridged in a single summit. Barak's coalition back home was already threatening to collapse, and Arafat faced pressure from Hamas and even factions within his own Fatah faction, who viewed Oslo as a failure. The talks collapsed over the same fault lines that had always divided them: Jerusalem, borders, and the right of return for millions of Palestinian refugees. Israeli Prime Minister Barak's offers were unprecedented. Israel would give Palestinians 91 to 92% of the West Bank and all of Gaza, plus land swaps from pre-1967 Israel, representing 1 to 3% in additional land to make up the difference. Israel offered Palestine custodianship over parts of East Jerusalem and administrative control over Arab neighborhoods. Israel refused full right of return for the 4 to 5 million Palestinian refugees displaced since 1948. Instead, Barak proposed a symbolic return of 100,000 refugees on humanitarian grounds and a multinational compensation fund for the rest. Arafat considered this unacceptable, as it effectively renounced the refugees' legal right to return under UN Resolution 194. The right of return was not just some bargaining chip, it was the foundational promise of the Palestinian national movement for over 50 years. Of the second point, Arafat rejected the proposal outright, telling Clinton that offering Palestinians a capital without the Al-Aqsa Mosque was like offering the Vatican without St. Peter's Basilica. And as for the first point, Arafat rejected Israel's land offer because it left Palestinians isolated in non-contiguous enclaves broken apart by Israeli-controlled roads. Israel would also retain airspace, water rights, and borders, meaning the proposed Palestinian state would not have true sovereignty at all. Arafat refused to sign the deal, arguing that the offer violated UN resolutions that had called for full withdrawal to 1967 borders and full sovereignty over East Jerusalem. Clinton and Barak would both later blame Arafat for missing an opportunity, but negotiators like Robert Malley and Hussein Agha later stated that neither side was ready for a final agreement and that the Israeli offer was not nearly as generous as had been portrayed to the public. 2 months later, on September 28, 2000, Ariel Sharon, the hardline former general and leader of Israel's Likud party, ascended the Haram al-Sharif, known to Jews as the Temple Mount, and to Muslims as the site of the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock. It is one of the holiest places in Islam, where the Prophet Muhammad is believed to have ascended to heaven nearly 1400 years ago. It is also among the holiest in Judaism, believed to be the site of the ancient temple. Sharon arrived surrounded by nearly 1,000 Israeli police officers. He had sought formal approval for the visit from Prime Minister Barak, who reluctantly allowed it on the condition that Sharon not enter the mosques themselves. Barak would later admit that this was a mistake. Everyone in Israel knew what the visit meant. Sharon, already infamous for his role in the 1982 Lebanon War, recalled that it was Sharon, then the Minister of Defense, who was found by his own country to bear personal responsibility for the slaughter of civilians in the Sabra and Shatila refugee communities. As news of Sharon's presence spread, outrage erupted across the occupied territories. Thousands gathered spontaneously in protest as they left their Friday prayers at the same holy place Sharon had defiled just yesterday. They hurled stones at Israeli police. The police responded with rubber bullets and tear gas, and finally, live ammunition. Within days, the violence had spread from Jerusalem to Gaza to Nablus, as far as Ramallah. The Israeli government called it a riot. Palestinians called it the Al-Aqsa Intifada, the uprising of Al-Aqsa. The Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF, took over from the police, adding tank shells and helicopter gunships to the fray. By October 5th, more than 70 Palestinians and several Israeli soldiers were killed. The IDF claimed it was responding to armed gunfire from Palestinian militants mixed in with the crowds, and perhaps they were, but multiple human rights organizations, including B'Tselem, Amnesty International, and Human Rights Watch, reported that Israeli forces fired live rounds at unarmed demonstrators, including children and journalists. Over the next 5 years, the death toll would climb into the thousands. Suicide bombings orchestrated by an increasingly popular Hamas continued. Hamas leaders were assassinated, the infrastructure demolished, airstrikes, a cycle of vengeance that consumed both peoples. There was simply nothing left of peace. One must imagine that this was exactly what Sharon wanted, an end to peace. By 2001, Palestinian Authority security forces and Hamas militants would be fighting each other, in addition to confronting Israel. Hamas framed itself as a true resistance movement throughout the 5 years of this second intifada, while Arafat's PA appeared weak and ineffective. The uprising would lead to Israel holding an early special election for prime minister, as Ehud Barak's popularity among the people collapsed. Ariel Sharon, that same Ariel Sharon who had kicked off the uprising just the year before, won by a landslide, 62 to 37%. His platform? Security, and an end to negotiations with Arafat. Netanyahu was roaring to get back into the ring too. On September 11, 2001, a terrorist attack on American soil orchestrated by Saudi-born millionaire and religious extremist Osama bin Laden shattered the illusion that America controlled the world. Nearly 3,000 Americans died that day, along with 19 jihadist hijackers. Netanyahu seized on that tragedy. He published and promoted his earlier book, Fighting Terrorism, becoming a sought-after guest on Western news programs and talk shows.
They see the United States as the great Satan. We in Israel, by the way, are the little Satan.
To the American people, he framed Israel's fight against Palestinian militants as part of the global war on terror. To his own people, he mocked the United States' peace efforts and promised more permanent solutions. Today, everyone understands the slogan, "The settlements are here." It is everywhere. What's the difference? What do you think Arafat wants? He wants one big settlement that is called Tel Aviv. As far as they're concerned, I think the territorial waters are also theirs. That they want us to be pushed into the sea is obvious, but only further away. The main thing is, first of all, to strike them, not once, but several times. So painfully that the price they pay will be unbearable. So far, the price tag is not unbearable. A large-scale attack on the Palestinian Authority, causing them to fear that everything is about to collapse. Fear is what brings them to.
Hold on, but then again, the world will say that we're aggressors.
They can say whatever they want.
Aren't you afraid of what they'll say, Bibi?
No, especially today with the US. I know how they are. America is something that you can easily maneuver and move in the right direction. And even if they say something, so then they say something, so what? 80% of Americans support us. It's absurd. We have such support there, and here we're thinking what we should do if. Look, I wasn't afraid to maneuver the Clinton administration. I wasn't afraid to confront Clinton. I wasn't afraid to go against the UN. What happened with the Oslo Accords? This renewed visibility would lead him to re-entering the Knesset in 2002 as the foreign minister and later finance minister under Ariel Sharon, whom he'd previously criticized for being too soft on Palestinians. He would push for neoliberal economic reforms and privatization inside Israel. Tax cuts for the rich, slashed welfare benefits and child allowances for the poor. Israel, by the way, is one of the many nations with universal health care for all of its citizens, ever since the passing of the National Health Insurance Law of 1995. This is indeed a luxury that the United States of America, which subsidizes Israel to the tune of $3.8 billion per year, cannot afford. When Yasser Arafat died in November of 2004, the secular nationalist Palestinian Authority lost its unifying figure of 35 years. By this time, Hamas had become the most organized and disciplined political force in Gaza, thanks to its vast social and religious networks. Between the 1990s and now, Hamas had been organizing a parallel infrastructure of mosques, charities, schools, and clinics throughout Gaza. Their organization had grassroots legitimacy. In August of 2005, something unprecedented happened. Ariel Sharon withdrew all Israeli settlers and troops from Gaza. He did not negotiate this move with the PA or set up any transitional plans. There had been no negotiations to give legitimacy to the retreat. Hamas was able to claim victory through their resistance. Armed struggle had at last succeeded where diplomacy had failed for generations. Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh and others publicly declared, "Gaza has been liberated by the blood of our martyrs." Netanyahu, in his resignation letter to Sharon, wrote, "The moment of truth has come. I cannot sanction a decision which threatens state security." In January 2006, the Palestinian Legislative Council elections were held, the first free election in a decade. To the shock of the international community, but hopefully to the shock now of no one at all, the ultranationalist Hamas won a majority, taking 74 of 132 seats. Arafat's old party, Fatah, won only 45. The US, Israel, and the EU refused to recognize Palestine's new government under Ismail Haniyeh, unless Hamas renounced violence, recognized Israel, and accepted previous peace accords. Hamas rejected these demands, just as Arafat had rejected them 6 years earlier. By the next year, tensions between Hamas and Fatah escalated into open conflict. In June, after months of street battles and assassinations, Hamas fighters seized control of the Gaza Strip, expelling Fatah officials and security forces that had been loyal to the Palestinian Authority. This brief but brutal civil war left hundreds of Palestinians dead, and from that moment on, the Palestinian territories were divided into two. Hamas ruled Gaza, and Fatah governed the West Bank. Israel and Egypt immediately imposed a blockade on Gaza, sealing its borders by land, air, and sea. Nearly 2 million Palestinians would now live behind walls and barbed wire. It was the collective punishment of Gaza's entire civilian population, illegal under international law. From December of 2008 to January the next year, Israel launched Operation Cast Lead, further intensifying the blockade. By this time, Gaza's economy had collapsed. Around 80% of residents depended on humanitarian aid to survive. Power outages, unemployment, and malnutrition were rampant. By the time Netanyahu was re-elected as Israel's prime minister in February, the blockade was already in its third year. Netanyahu's government continued to coordinate with Egypt to maintain strict control of Gaza's borders. Naval patrols blocked Palestinian fishing and intercepted aid flotillas, leading perhaps most notably to the 2010 Mavi Marmara incident, in which a Turkish humanitarian organization had deployed a convoy of 6 civilian ships carrying aid supplies, food, medicine, construction materials. Activists from around 40 countries set out with the goal to break the Israeli blockade of Gaza by sea and to draw attention to the humanitarian crisis there. On May 31st, Israeli naval commandos intercepted the flotilla in international waters, about 70 nautical miles off the Gaza coast. When they boarded the lead ship, the Mavi Marmara, carrying more than 600 passengers, violent clashes erupted. Passengers resisted with metal rods, knives, and makeshift weapons. Israeli forces answered with bullets. 10 Turkish activists were murdered, with dozens more injured. The UN Human Rights Council condemned Israel's actions as unlawful and disproportionate. The blockade remained in place, though Israel slightly loosened restrictions in response to international outrage over the incident. Netanyahu raised food imports from around 2,400 tons per week to around 6,000 tons per week. Exports from Gaza, like fruits, furniture, and textiles, remained almost completely banned. In the year 2011, the Arab Spring swept across the region, toppling governments from Tunis to Cairo. In Palestine, though, nothing changed. The Palestinian Authority clung to power in the West Bank while Hamas ruled Gaza. 2 governments, 2 ideologies, no state between them. The dream of unity was shattered now beyond all recognition. And then came the wars. On November 14, 2012, Israel assassinated Ahmed Jabari, the commander of Hamas's military wing, who had been instrumental in negotiating prisoner exchanges and was effectively Hamas's top field commander. In retaliation, Hamas and Islamic Jihad fired hundreds of rockets into Israel, reaching as far as Tel Aviv and Jerusalem for the first time. Israel launched Operation Pillar of Defense, targeting rocket launch sites, weapons depots, and Hamas infrastructure with intense airstrikes. The aerial bombardment was massive. By 2014, Gaza's unemployment rate had soared above 40%. 4 out of 5 people depended on food aid. Children grew up under Israeli surveillance drones. The average age was 17. Meanwhile, in the West Bank, Israeli settlements kept expanding, cutting deeper and deeper into the land that was supposed to have become a Palestinian state someday. New outposts rose on hilltops, connected by roads that only Israelis were allowed to drive. The apartheid everyone swore didn't exist began to look unmistakably real. All those years blurred together: rockets, funerals, international condemnations and hand-wringing, and the endless hum of drones. When the United States brokered the Abraham Accords in 2020, normalizing relations between Israel and wealthy Arab monarchies, including the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco, the message to Palestinians was unmistakable. Your struggle no longer matters. You're not a part of this conversation anymore. Find your bootstraps. In May of 2021, after weeks of clashes in Jerusalem and police raids inside the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound, Hamas began firing rockets toward Israeli cities. Israel launched massive airstrikes in response. For 11 days, hellfire rained down on the Gaza Strip. Entire residential blocks were destroyed, leveled. Over 250 Palestinians were killed, including many children, according to estimates of the United Nations. By contrast, 13 people were killed in Israel, mostly by rocket fire. When the ceasefire finally came, Gaza's infrastructure lay in ruins once again. Water lines shattered, power plants offline, dozens of residential towers leveled, over 100,000 residents now displaced. Reconstruction would take years for the people of Palestine, even as the blockade remained firmly in place with no exit strategy, no hope for peace, no notice from the international community, apart from the pleas of the most strident activists. In late 2022 and early 2023, Israeli politics began shifting further and further to the right. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu returned to office once more at the head of a coalition that included far-right nationalists and religious parties. He would create the most extreme right-wing government Israel had ever seen, with such administrators as Itamar Ben-Gurion, leader of Jewish Power, and Bezalel Smotrich, leader of the religious Zionism party, who was given authority over civil administration in the West Bank. effectively leaving him in control of settlement policy. And Aryeh Deri, leader of the ultra-Orthodox Shas party, was given major influence over welfare and religious affairs. In Gaza, Hamas continued to rebuild tunnels and rocket stockpiles under the blockade. The Palestinian Authority in the West Bank grew increasingly unpopular and authoritarian as settlement expansion accelerated and the quality of life for those West Bank Palestinians trapped within their own homes became increasingly dire. The Supernova Sukkot Gathering was an all-night outdoor trance music festival held near Kibbutz Re'em, about 5 kilometers from the Gaza border. It began on October 6 during the Jewish holiday of Simchat Torah, or Sukkot. At dawn the next day, Hamas launched a surprise attack on Israel, firing thousands of rockets and sending armed militants across the border into nearby towns and kibbutzim. More than 1,100 Israelis were killed, most of them civilians, and over 200 were taken hostage. One of their many targets was the music festival, where alone 360 Israelis were murdered. Netanyahu was not prepared for the attack. His own nation had been in deep political turmoil all year over the Prime Minister's judicial overhaul agenda. Mass protests had erupted over his plan to weaken the powers of Israel's Supreme Court, including restricting the court's ability to review laws or government decisions on reasonableness grounds. These proposals sparked the largest sustained protests in Israeli history. Every weekend from January onward, hundreds of thousands of Israelis marched in cities like Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and Haifa. Demonstrators saw the overhaul as a threat to Israel's democracy. Netanyahu's supporters claimed it was needed to curb judicial activism. Israel declared war the day after the attack and began a sustained bombing campaign in Gaza. Thousands of Palestinians were killed in the first weeks of airstrikes, and the humanitarian crisis deepened as electricity, water, and fuel supplies were cut off entirely. While many Israelis supported their country's military response, questions began surfacing almost immediately about how such an intelligence and security failure could happen. Families of hostages and victims organized daily demonstrations, demanding government accountability and a clear plan for rescuing the captives. The events of October 7th marked the collapse of what little stability had existed since the last major war. Israel's Zionist right wing took from October 7th exactly what they needed: a moral justification for the genocide of all Palestinians living within Israel's self-declared borders. People around the world continue to debate whether or not what is happening to Palestinians in Israel can actually be considered a genocide. And among those who agree that it is, in fact, a genocide, there is further debate as to whether or not that genocide is justifiable. I hope this message reaches you in peace.
This is not only the end of a war, this is the end of an age of terror and death and the beginning of the age of faith and hope and of God. It's the start of a grand concord and lasting harmony for Israel and all the nations of what will soon be a truly magnificent region. I believe that so strongly. This is the historic dawn of a new Middle East. Generations from now, this will be remembered as the moment that everything began to change, and change very much for the better.
Every few years, whenever Israel signs another peace agreement or a ceasefire with one of their neighbors, the great powers of the world congratulate themselves for achieving peace in the Middle East, as if wounds such as these can be healed with a piece of paper and some ink. There has never been peace nor justice for the Palestinian people. The attacks on October 7th, 2023, as tragic a blight on our history as they were, they did not happen in a vacuum. No more than the Rhineland massacre of 1096, where Christian peasants on a crusade slaughtered thousands of innocent Jews along their way to Jerusalem. No more than the Christian Crusaders' slaughter of the civilians of Jerusalem just 3 years later. No more than the My Lai massacre in 1968, where hundreds of women, children, and the elderly were slaughtered, violated, and mutilated by regular American citizens turned into soldiers of the capitalist counter-revolution. No more than the terrorist attacks against the American Empire on September 11th, 2001. We allow our leaders to tell us who the good guys are and who the bad guys are, but it really is not us versus them. It is us and them together versus our oppressors and their oppressors together. What's happening in the West Bank, and especially in Gaza, is the systematic destruction of an imprisoned, stateless native population, carried out with extreme prejudice by a heartless 21st century military equipped with Western weapons, capitalist funding, and international bureaucratic cover. Will we find solidarity with our brothers and sisters in Palestine before the last light of our humanity is extinguished? In July of 2025, just 4 months ago as of this writing, Netanyahu's government voted 71-13 in favor of a non-binding motion calling to annex the West Bank, where cement trucks have already been filling wells with cement to deprive the natives of that most basic human necessity. Only the Arab parties and the Israeli Democrats voted against the motion. Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas's deputy, Hussein al-Sheikh, called the annexation vote a dangerous escalation that undermines the prospects for peace, stability, and the two-state solution. "This is our land, this is our home," Knesset Speaker Amir Ohana said after the vote. "The land of Israel belongs to the people of Israel. In 1967, the occupation did not begin, it ended, and our homeland was returned to its rightful owners. We are the original first natives of this piece of land. Jews cannot be the occupier of a land that for 3,000 years has been called Judea." Netanyahu has cautioned his party to abstain from voting on an actual annexation, fearing backlash from a United States whose own citizens are appearing increasingly alarmed by the rise of right-wing fascism around the world. Many Israeli settlers, on the other hand, are champing at the bit to occupy Gaza and the rest of the West Bank, and the United Nations might have just made their dreams come true. On November 17th of this year, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 2803 to give effect to the Gaza peace plan, which isn't so much a peace plan to benefit the people of Palestine, but rather to convert the Gaza Strip into prime real estate and to give the US a permanent presence in the planned trade corridor connecting India and Europe via the Mediterranean. This is all happening unless we vote them out of power. Unless we, who are fortunate enough to live within the imperial core, are able to pressure Israel to seek actual peace with the people of Palestine. By the time this video is published, the West Bank may already be annexed into Israel. Trump may have already broken ground in Gaza for his new resort. Violence in the Middle East will never stop until we accept and combat its root cause, which is the greatest enemy of our species, the systems of hierarchy themselves. Religion, nation, race, class, sex. These are the systems that pit humans against each other and prevent us from seeing the strength in our solidarity, in our community. We are not born as enemies. We are born and must die as human beings, but we do not have to die as enemies. Few historians would dare argue that our hand did not shape much of the world's turmoil, that our comforts, our endless greed and excess, even today this all comes at the cost of their immeasurable suffering. Our empires created these conditions, just as Victor Frankenstein created his Prometheus. Shelley's novel, written in 1818 during Europe's Industrial Revolution, is about the consequences of human hubris, of creating something you refuse to take responsibility for. Our empires refuse to take responsibility for the suffering throughout all the world's lands that were plundered and despoiled and enslaved at the barrel of their guns. Our empires won't even take responsibility for their own people. What does that tell you? Frankenstein dies from exhaustion and illness aboard a ship in the Arctic, tormented by guilt and regret for his many sins. We are looking through a keyhole, and that keyhole is part of a door. That door isn't locked. It is a little difficult to open. There's centuries, millennia of propaganda blocking the door from the other side. We must help each other push open this door, so that together we can find our true strength as a human species at long last. Our true strength is community. Let me know what you think. If you profited from this video, please like and subscribe for more like it. I love to hear your comments and talk about these stories with you too. If you're doing well financially, please consider supporting my work by buying me a coffee or sharing this with a friend.
And finally, one could say that the Palestinians have been paying for Europe's guilty conscience for 31 years. And one could say that the state of Israel was not created to save the Jews, but to protect Western interests at the gate of the Middle East. And I don't think that it's right for the Palestinians to pay for Europe's crimes.